This is a video response to TheTruePooka on his video entitled Race Realists Are Sneaky Statists. To be frank, I'm essentially going to be arguing that just about everything he says here is either wrong or unjustified. So rather than beating around the bush with some long introduction, let's just get into the meat of picking apart TheTruePooka's video, shall we?
Let's examine the position of the self-proclaimed anarcho-capitalist segregationist, or as I like to call them, the statist segregationists. It's really a more accurate classification of the segregationist position, at least if you use libertarian terminology. Then, it's a more accurate defining of their position. Yes, I know there are a number of anarcho-capitalist or similar-styled libertarians out there, like Fringe Elements or Heritability, saying, "How can you accuse us of being statist, Pooka? We say we're anarcho-capitalists." Let me explain to my subscribers what I'm talking about. These are the race realist segregationists. Essentially what you have is a group of people who search for justifications, be it psychological or biological, that the races should live separately from each other.
First off, it's worth mentioning that race realism is a positive proposition, not a normative one. The distinction here is rather crucial, and it is one which TheTruePooka seemingly either does not understand or ignores. A normative proposition or statement is one that makes a subjective value judgment where something, usually an action, is judged to be undesirable or desirable, or that a particular state of affairs should or should not be the case. Examples of this could be seen by the following statements. Murder is wrong. Vanilla is better than chocolate. We ought to have universal health care. A positive proposition or statement, by contrast, is one in which the utterer attempts to describe a series of empirical and falsifiable facts without making any value judgment. Examples of this might be, on Earth things fall down, my glass is full of water, etc. Race realism is the position that there are biological races that are real, and that many, though not all, of the average gaps in behavior, intelligence, and other phenotypes between the human races is due to genetic factors, and not due to the environment. This position in and of itself does not entail any particular political position, such as segregation, which is a normative proposition. Correct or not, race realism is a positive proposition that merely attempts to describe what the facts of the matter on race differences are. Thus, when TheTruePooka seems to either imply that there is some sort of necessary connection between segregation, the initiation of force, statism, anarcho-capitalism, and race realism, he is either ignorant of what the facts are, or he's dishonest. And I don't think either of those possibilities are very flattering. Secondly, it's worth noting that TheTruePooka asserts that both Fringe Elements and Heritability and what seem to be a whole host of other unnamed persons are, quote, anarcho-capitalist statist segregationists. Mind you, his assertion is not the conclusion of some sort of rational argument. It is only a stand-alone assertion that lacks any justification. Had TheTruePooka said something like, Premise 1, an anarcho-capitalist statist segregationist is someone who supports anarcho-capitalism and also using both the state and federal government to forcibly impose racial segregation. Premise 2. Both Fringe Elements and Heritability at time T have said that they are anarcho-capitalists and that they support using the state or federal government to forcibly impose racial segregation. Conclusion. Therefore, it is highly probable that currently they are anarcho-capitalist statist segregationists. Had TheTruePooka done something akin to this, while providing some empirical evidence for Premise 2, we might have some reason to take what he says seriously. However, as it currently stands, he provided no empirical evidence and justification for his assertion, so his assertion is merely an empty and vacuous assertion.
Oh, and for the record, I acknowledge that race is largely a social construct. Yes, there are hereditary aspects as well, depending on how you define race. You know what? That's not important to what I'm doing here. For this video, I'm accepting their concept of race, which is, to them, it essentially means white people, black people, yellow people, and red people.
TheTruePooka says that although he rejects race mostly as a social construct, he will accept the definition of race used by race realists for the purposes of having a discussion on the topic. However, his description of how so-called race realists define race is a vague, vulgar oversimplification at best, when he says that they conceive of race as white people, black people, yellow people, and red people. To gain a better understanding about how race realists conceive of race, all cite Arthur Jensen, a professor of psychology emeritus at UC Berkeley, specializing in general intelligence and racial intelligence. It's worth mentioning that Arthur Jensen was awarded the Kersler Prize for advancing the understanding of the role of heredity in human society, and he has also received the International Society for Intelligence Research's Lifetime Achievement Award for his contributions to intelligence research. The following is a passage from the book Intelligence, Race, and Genetics, Conversations with Arthur Jensen, page 115. Quote, "There are two definitions of race. There is simply different ways of viewing the concept, and both of them are completely compatible. First, in biological taxonomy, a given species typically has a number of distinguishable subspecies, or varieties. In human species, Homo sapien, the subspecies are called races. Species generally are highly and clearly differentiated in a number of physical and even behavioral characteristics, and the different species are not interfertile, although in very rare cases, matings between certain very related species can produce offspring. Therefore, one does not see a blending or continuous intermediate gradation of physical characteristics between different species. Within any species, however, there are subspecies that are truly interfertile, and their offspring show a blending of characteristics, both of the subspecies. In the course of evolution, subspecies, or races, have developed as the result of genetic isolation and natural selection. Because isolation of groups is not 100%, and because races are interfertile, they're not distinct categories or pure types that exist within other species. Races have been called fuzzy sets because rather than having distinct boundaries, we see a continuous blending of characteristics that, on average, distinguish the groups as races. The relative geographic isolation of Africa from Europe and of both of these continents from Asia, combined with the prehistoric hazards of such migration of such long distances, produced the three greatest and most clearly distinguishable groups: Sub-Saharan Africans, Caucasians, and Mongoloids. There is considerable variation between these broad groups, of course, and there are many derivatives or blended groups that could also be called races. The number of races one wishes to distinguish by certain criteria depend on the criteria used, and how fine-grained the distinctions are. A precise number of races is an open-ended and arguable issue. A certain blood group criteria, for example, would allow one to distinguish North Chinese and South Chinese, and between North Europeans and South Europeans. The criteria for all classifications, however, is genetically based. These same type of arguments go on between lumpers, who like to lump the categories together to reduce their number, and splitters, who like to split categories into a greater number of smaller parts. Among taxonomists who study species and subspecies of plants and animals, and among paleoanthropologists who study human evolution and classify fossils, and even among dinosaur hunters. The important point is that average differences between individuals within a group is less than the average difference between groups on the relevant physical characteristics, whether at the molecular level or the gross physical level of measurements. In population genetics, races are defined as breeding populations that differ in the frequency of one or more genes. The number of genes in which various population groups differ serves as an index for the genetic distance between them, and the world's population can be divided into subpopulations based on their genetic distances. Again, the number of populations will be somewhat arbitrary, depending on how finely one wishes to divide the continuous scale of genetic distances, but it is nevertheless objective.
Primarily, their arguments come under two claims. One, The races are incapable of coexisting in peace. Violence and disharmony is inevitable. 2. The races should be kept separate because interbreeding diminishes IQ of the superior races.
Who are the proponents of this argument that TheTruePooka is talking about? He has yet to successfully argue that his so-called category applies to any particular individual, let alone a group, until he makes some argument convincingly demonstrating that his category aptly characterizes someone. We have no reason to see any difference between the race realist status segregationists and a figment of the TheTruePooka's imagination.
Now, the first statement, the segregationists are right, but for the wrong reasons. Yes, humans will have conflict between different races, but that's because humans will have conflict over just about anything.
What reason do we have to believe that these people are right for the wrong reasons? The TheTruePooka never gives us any justification for this statement. He also never explains why it is supposedly the case that humans will have conflict over just about anything, or what this entails.
As humans evolve, we develop not just a form of biological altruism, but also mistrust as well. People that we behave altruistically towards are those we classify as part of the group. Those that we act suspicious of and mistrustful of are those who are not part of the group. These two conflicting behaviors work together in tandem to make a decent survival skill set for a successful social group. It's a necessary component for human survival. I'm of the opinion that racism is a byproduct of the biological and mental processes that work together so that humans can recognize and classify people as outsiders or members of the group. Racism is essentially the flaw or byproduct error in what is a pretty decently evolved system. But racism in this modern age is actually a negative survival trait that is damaging to human beings, or it is a symptom of an unhealthy society.
A healthy society is a relative concept. So, if all societies have biologically rooted racism, then what sense does it make to say that racism in a society is a symptom of a particularly unhealthy society?
Now, humans can swiftly classify others as not part of the group based on any number of arbitrary characteristics, and not just according to surface biological characteristics such as race.
Earlier, the TheTruePooka said that although he did not agree with race realist definition of race, he would grant it for the purposes of a debate. However, here he asserts that race is just a surface biological characteristic, which is not how race realists conceive of race. So here, he explicitly contradicts his earlier statement when he said that he was granting a more hereditarian conception of race.
Left-handed versus right-handed, Southern accent versus Canadian accent, Yankees fan versus Mets fan, Muslim versus Christian, pie lover versus cake lover, you name it. If you can perceive a difference between yourself and another, you've got the potential for violent interaction. So unless you're going to start segregating people to prevent violent interaction to such a degree that you end up with social groups consisting of one person per one group, well, the racial disharmony argument falls apart. It fails.
First of all, the probability for conflict arising in differences in phenotypic traits for human populations depends on what those particular traits are. The probabilistic level of conflict that occurs because of such differences is not equal for all types of differences. For instance, we do not hear of, nor am I aware of any, convincing evidence for wide-scale societal conflict or wars that result in the death of more than 1,000 persons between left-handed and right-handed people, between people with Southern and Canadian accents, between Yankee and Mets fans, and between cake and pie lovers. However, when it comes to ethnic and racial diversity, we have evidence that it has not only led to serious societal conflicts, but also an increasingly number of wars. According to one recent estimate, nearly 2/3 of the world's armed conflicts at the time included an ethnic component. Indeed, ethnic conflicts are 4 times more likely than interstate wars. Estimates of the numbers who have died in ethnic conflicts are difficult to reach and often disagree. but according to one respected study by political scientist David Lantin and James Ferrone, since the end of World War II, 16.5 million people have died in internal conflicts, mostly ethnically based, compared with 3.3 million in interstate wars. Other estimates of ethnic conflict place the death toll at around 20 million or more. Today, ethnic hostilities threaten to break up countries such as Afghanistan, Iraq, Liberia, and Uganda. Moreover, ethnic divisions may be harmful even when they do not lead to violence. Research by an increasing number of economists and political scientists have indicated that in Africa and elsewhere, the more ethnically diverse the country, the more poor it tends to perform economically. Let's move on. TheTruePooka's notion that the only policy solution to deal with the problems of diversity would be to atomize everyone from each other 100% is ridiculous. It is a non sequitur of epic proportions. First and foremost, the claim that diversity leads to conflict is a positive claim, not a normative one, and you cannot derive an ought from an is without making a proposition that does not follow. This is the very essence of the is-ought gap. Furthermore, if you added an additional moral premise to make a full argument such as diversity leads to conflict, things that lead to conflict ought to be curtailed, therefore something ought to be done to curtail diversity, it does not follow that the only thing that could be done is to atomize society completely. There could be any number of largely voluntary policy propositions that adhere to the principle of proportionality implemented to deal with the problems of diversity, such as securing the borders, eliminating welfare programs, abolishing affirmative action, or ending the forcible desegregation efforts of the federal government in American schools and housing projects.
The excessive disharmony between humans who have differences from other humans is an unfortunate byproduct of a reasonably good system, and segregating by race will do absolutely nothing to prevent the disharmony from occurring. And anyone who denies this, I will collect every written text on civil and criminal code that has ever existed, and I shall stand there and pelt you with them, one after the other, until you give in and acknowledge that segregation will do absolutely nothing to aid human beings in achieving harmony.
Ignoring the fact that TheTruePooka appears to be arguing against an unidentified phantom, what he says doesn't even make sense. What does the history of civil and criminal code have to do with demonstrating that segregation, voluntary or forced, reduces or increases conflict and disharmony arising from society? Laws are systems of enforced prescriptions in society. They are not a set of scientific arguments for or against anything. Thus, referencing the history of civil and criminal codes of various states seems to be just a giant red herring. I also find it very ironic that TheTruePooka would mention criminal laws as being some sort of argument against segregation, especially seeing that every system of criminal codes of which I am aware explicitly mandate segregation for people that commit certain crimes. For example, if I am convicted in a court of law of the crime of murder, I will go to jail, and thus the state will segregate me from the general population for my actions, and will put me in prison. And I think very few people would object to this sort of behavior.
My second point, here it is again for anyone who may have forgotten it, let's assume for the sake of argument that the racial realists are correct. They aren't. But let's assume that despite not having the science to back up their claims, let's pretend race does exist across genetic lines, and there is a hereditary only IQ difference between the races.
What's amazing here is how confidently TheTruePooka denies the fact that there's evidence of a lowering of average IQ upon race mixing, despite providing no evidence whatsoever to back up his claim. He just asserts it as if it were some axiom, instead of an empirical matter of her discussion. Other than the lack of justification, the problem with his assertion is the existence of the phenomena known as regression to the mean. To explain what regression to the mean is, let me quote a joint paper titled 30 Years of Research on Race Differences in Cognitive Ability, published in the Journal of Psychology, Public Policy, and Law by Arthur Jensen and Philip Rushton, who is a professor of psychology at the University of Ontario. Quote, Regression to the mean provides still another means of testing if group differences are genetic. Regression toward the mean is seen on average when individuals with high IQ scores mate and their children have lower scores than their parents. This is because the parents pass on some, but not all of their genes to their offspring. The converse happens for the low IQ parents. They have children with somewhat higher IQs. Although the parents pass on a random half of their genes to their offspring, they cannot pass on the particular combinations of genes that cause their own exceptionality. This is analogous to rolling a pair of dice and having them come up 2 6s or 2 1s. The odds are that on the next roll, you will have some value that is not quite as high or as low. Physical and psychological traits involving dominant and recessive genes show some regression effect. Genetic theory predicts the magnitude of the regression effect to be smaller the closer the degree of kinship between individuals being compared, e.g., identical twins, full siblings, or half-siblings. Culture-only theory makes no systematic or quantitative predictions. For any trait, scores should move back to the average for that population. So, in the United States, genetic theory predicts that children of black parents of an IQ of 115 will regress toward the black average of 85, whereas children of white parents of an IQ of 115 will regress toward the white average of 100. Similarly, children of black parents of an IQ of 70 should move up toward the black IQ average of 85, whereas children of white parents of an IQ of 70 should move up to the white average of 100. This hypothesis has been tested and the predictions confirmed. Regression would explain why black children born to high IQ, wealthy black parents have test scores 2 to 4 points lower than do white children born to low IQ, poor white parents. High IQ black parents do not pass on the full measure of their genetic advantage to their children, even though they give them a good upbringing, good schools, often better than their own. The same, of course, applies to high IQ white parents. Culture-only theory cannot predict these results, but must argue that some cultural factors somehow imitate the effect theoretically predicted by genetic theory, which have also been demonstrated in studies of physical traits in animals. Jensen tested the regression predictions with data from siblings, 900 white sibling pairs and 500 black sibling pairs. These provided an even better test than parent-offspring combinations, because the siblings share very similar environments. Black and white children matched for IQ had siblings who regressed approximately halfway to their respective population means, rather than to the mean of the combined population. For example, when the black children and the white children were matched with IQs of 120, the siblings of the black children averaged closer to 100, whereas the siblings of the white children averaged closer to 110. The reverse effect was found with children matched at the lower end of the IQ scale. When black children and white children were matched for IQs of 70, the siblings of the black children averaged about 78, where the siblings of the white children averaged about 85. The regression line showed no significant departure from the linearity throughout the range of IQ from 50 to 150, as predicted by genetic theory, not by culture-only theory." End quote. In addition, mulattoes typically have an IQ somewhere between that of blacks and whites, with a range typically in the low to mid-90s according to Rowe's examination of the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health. Furthermore, following this hereditarian model, we would predict that mulattoes would regress to an IQ to a mean that of between blacks and whites, thus entailing that miscegenation between blacks and whites would tend to lower the average IQ of the general population. Furthermore, additional evidence for this lowering of IQ upon miscegenation can be seen from Rushton and Jensen in their 2010 reply to Nisbet, published in the Open Psychology Journal. Their paper says, quote, "Bean found, as did Pearl, that among blacks, the greater amount of white admixture, judged independently from skin color, the higher the mean brain weight at autopsy." Subsequently, Rushton examined 37 East Asian European hybrids, from the U.S. National Collaborative Prenatal Project and found that they fell intermediately in brain size and IQ to the non-racially mixed parental groups. We know that studies on over 700 participants show that individuals with larger brain volumes have higher IQ scores. About 24 studies using magnetic resonance imaging, MRI, to measure the volume of the human brain have found an overall correlation with IQ of greater than 0.4, a modest and significant correlation. Now, before I go into additional evidence, let me first define the word heritability. Heritability refers to the genetic contribution of individual differences, variants in a particular group, not to the phenotype of a single individual. A heritability of 1 means that all of the observed differences in the group are due to genetic differences and not at all due to differences in the environment. A heritability of 0 means the converse. A heritability of 0.5 means that the observed variation is equally the result of genetic and environmental differences. The heritability of height in modern industrial populations, for example, is about 90%, which means that most of the differences in height among the individuals are due to their genetic differences. A 2007 article titled Genetic Influences on Human Brain Structure, a review of brain imaging studies in twins, published in the Journal of Human Brain Mapping, is also helpful here. Researchers found that with regard to the heritability of brain size, based on a review of 14 different twin studies using CT to measure brain size, that there is a 0.81 heritability of global brain measures, a 0.66 to 0.97 heritability of brain volume, and a 0.82 to 0.88 heritability of gray and white matter. Thus, as mixed-race individuals tend to have lower average brain size than the ancestral higher IQ racial population they inherited their genes from, and since there is a modest and significant correlation between IQ and brain size, and since brain size is extremely heritable, individual differences within a group are due to genetic factors and not to the environment. This would entail that because of average genetic differences, there is a high probability that the offspring of interracial couples would tend to have a lower average IQ than similar matings of monoracial couples of high IQ races.
When you examine how swiftly IQ levels can change in a population group over just a few decades, my response to this is a great big whopping, so what?
To a greater level of conflict, as TheTruePooka seems to have suggested. And if IQ scores increase the Flynn effect but do not converge, then we would predict that the differences, or gap, would be a factor responsible for increasing levels of interracial conflict. With this in mind, let's look at the Mainstream Science on Intelligence, a public statement issued by a group of academic researchers. In this statement, researchers presented the findings widely accepted in the expert community. Mainstream Science on Intelligence statement is signed by 52 university professors specializing in intelligence and related fields, including around 1/3 of the editorial board of the journal Intelligence. Conclusion 19 in their public statement says, quote, "There is no persuasive evidence that the IQ bell curve for different racial ethnic groups are converging." Following TheTruePooka's logic, this would entail an increase in interracial conflict due to differences, which is not something he should idly shrug off.
Even if you are right that there's a gap between the races, that IQ is entirely hereditary and fairly static, my answer is still so what? You have absolutely no evidence to show that the genetic mixing of the races will lead to a decrease in the overall IQ of the white population over time. That will then lead to a noticeable negative impact on society.
First off, nobody thinks that IQ is 100% heritable. I don't know where this notion came from. A widely cited measure of the heritability of IQ is from the article titled Intelligence, Knowns and Unknowns. This is a 1995 report issued by a task force created by the Board of Scientific Affairs of the American Psychological Association. The APA, through meta-analysis of the available research, put the heritability of IQ at 0.75, although the range is typically said to be between 0.5 and 0.9 for individuals past adolescence. This again raises the question, who is the TheTruePooka arguing against?
Your entire premise for segregation is based on race-mixing scare tactics. You cannot show that segregation will have a positive impact on society at all. Well, I can quite easily show that segregation will have a negative impact on today's society.
First off, it's worth noting that the TheTruePooka did not provide a shred of empirical evidence or argument detailing how someone couldn't show that segregation would not have a positive impact on society, or why it is the case that segregation allegedly will have a negative impact on society. But let's go into some of the evidence for the horrible pitfalls of diversity, shall we? And for the relative benefit or of homogeneous societies. First, we can look at the research of Tatu Van Hanen, a professor emeritus of political science at the University of Tampere in Finland, published in his book Ethnic Conflicts Explained by Ethnic Nepotism, which examines the relationship between ethnic or racial diversity and ethnic conflict. As a side note, I think most people would agree that ethnic conflict has a negative impact on society, and would therefore agree that factors strongly correlated with high levels of ethnic conflict would therefore be aptly regarded as having a negative impact on society. Moving on. During his research, Professor Van Hanen constructed what he calls an index of ethnic heterogeneity, which is on a number of a scale from 0 to 200, indicating how much ethnic, tribal, racial, and linguistic diversity is to be found in a country. Van Hanen also took religious differences into account when the religions were very old and their adherents had tended not to interbreed. He calculated the ethnic heterogeneity scores for every country in the world that has a population of more than 1 million. The lowest scores are 0 for North and South Korea, both extremely homogeneous societies, 1 for Lesotho, and 2 for Japan and Portugal. The highest scores are Chad, 144, Sudan, 124, and Bosnia-Herzegovina, 112. The United States has an score of 35, which puts it in line with such countries as Cuba, New Zealand, Russia, and Uzbekistan. Professor Van Hanen then constructed an index of ethnic conflict, likewise running from 0 to 200. He notes that conflict is even harder to quantify than ethnic diversity, but he included such things in his index such as the existence of ethnically based political parties, the degree to which national politics is an ethnic struggle, as well as levels of ethnic crime and communal violence. Van Hanen's results showed a very strong correlation of 0.72 between ethnic heterogeneity and ethnic conflict scores. There is a very clear-cut trend. The more diversity there exists in a society, the more ethnic conflict societies tend to have. The more segregated and homogeneous society, the less ethnic conflict and the more ethnic peace it tends to have. Thus, we can say that there is convincing evidence that homogeneous societies kept apart from diverse peoples tend strongly to have less ethnic conflict, and that this has a positive impact on society. Secondly, let's look at the research of Robert Putnam, a highly decorated political scientist and professor of public policy at Harvard University. In Putnam's paper, Diversity and Community in the 21st Century, published in 2007 in the Journal of Scandinavian Political Studies, Putnam examines the relationship between ethnic or racial diversity and social trust. As a side note, I think we can all agree that high social trust and participation in its many forms has a positive impact on society, whereas low social trust has a negative impact on society. In his paper, Putnam examines the peer-reviewed scientific literature on the subject. During his review, Putnam discovered the following on the relationship between diversity and social trust. He says, quote, "Across work groups in the United States as well as Europe, internal heterogeneity in terms of age, professional background, ethnicity, tenure, and other factors is generally associated with lower group cohesion, lower satisfaction, and higher turnover. Across countries, greater ethnic heterogeneity seems to be associated with lower social trust. Across local areas in the United States, Australia, Sweden, Canada, and Britain, greater ethnic diversity is associated with lower social trust and lower investment in public goods. Among Peruvian microcredit cooperatives, ethnic heterogeneity is associated with higher default rates. Across Kenyan school districts, ethno-linguistic diversity is associated with less voluntary fundraising. And in Pakistan, clan, religious, and political diversity are linked to the failure of collective infrastructure maintenance. Across the American Census Tract, greater ethnic heterogeneity is associated with lower rates of carpooling, a social practice that embodies trust and reciprocity. Also, within experimental game settings such as Prisoner's Dilemma or Ultimatum games, players who are more different from one another, regardless of whether or not they actually know each other, are more likely to defect or cheat. From here, Putnam dives into his own evidence. The evidence comes from a very large nationwide survey, the Social Capital Community Benchmark Survey, carried out in the year 2000, with a sample size of roughly 30,000. Embedded within the nationwide sample is a representative national sample of 3,000, as well as smaller samples representative of the 41 different communities across the United States. These communities differ in many ways: size, economic profile, region, education levels, etc. But for our purposes, it is important that they differ greatly in their ethnic diversity, and they do. Additionally, to quote Putnam, another important methodological feature of this survey was that it was conducted simultaneously with the national census of 2000, and virtually every interview in our survey was geocoded, i.e. the vast majority of our respondents, we know exactly where they live, and thus we know the demographic characteristics of the census tract within which they live. Thus we know not only the race, education, income, marital status, and so on of our respondents, but also the race, education, income, and marital status of and so on of their neighbors. Now, let's look at Putnam's first major finding on the relationship between racial or ethnic diversity and interracial trust in his own words. Quote, Figure 3 arrays our 41 different communities according to their ethnic diversity, and the average level of interracial trust expressed by our respondents in those communities. We asked every respondent how much he or she trusted whites, blacks, Asian Americans, and Hispanics, or Latinos, and we know the respondent's own ethnicity. So, this measure is simply the average trust expressed toward the other three ethnic categories. Obviously, Figure 3 shows a strong positive relationship between interracial trust and ethnic homogeneity. Interracial trust is relatively high in homogeneous South Dakota, and relatively low in heterogeneous San Francisco or Los Angeles. The more ethnically diverse the people we live around, the less we trust them. Putnam then goes on to describe his research on the relationship between ethnic diversity and the trust of neighbors when he says, quote, Figure 4 is directly comparable to Figure 3, except that our measure of social capital is trust in people who live in your neighborhood. Because of de facto residential segregation, most American neighborhoods are of the same race of their own, and yet Figure 4 shows exactly the same pattern. The differences across our 41 sites are very substantial in absolute terms. In highly diverse Los Angeles or San Francisco, roughly 30% of the inhabitants say that they trust their neighbors a lot, whereas in ethnically homogeneous communities of North and South Dakota, 70 to 80% of the inhabitants say the same. In the more diverse communities, people simply trust their neighbors less. In the last of his major points, Putnam goes on to show what happens to social trust in ethnically diverse communities among members of the same race. Putnam says, Figure 5 repeats the same story, but with one important difference. We ask about trust of people of the respondent's own race. How much do whites trust other whites, blacks trust other blacks, and Hispanics trust other Hispanics, and Asians other Asians? This figure charts an entirely unexpected correlation, for it shows that in-group trust too is lower in the more diverse setting. In other words, in more diverse settings, Americans distrust not merely people who do not look like them, but even people who do. Diversity seems to trigger not an in-group out-group division, but total anomie or social isolation. In colloquial language, people living in ethnically diverse settings appear to hunker down, that is, to pull in like a turtle. Finally, here are some of the patterns that have emerged in behavior of the individuals in Putnam's study in his own words. Quote, "So far, I have limited my presentation to evidence regarding social trust, and this is true, that the most impressive and substantial patterns we have discovered involve trust of various sorts, including even trust of shop clerks. However, a wide array of other measures of social capital and civic engagement are also negatively correlated with ethnic diversity. In areas of greater ethnic diversity, our respondents demonstrate lower confidence in local government, local leaders, and the local news media, lower political efficacy, that is, confidence in their own influence, lower frequency of registering to vote, but more interest and knowledge about politics, and more participation in protest march and social reform groups, less expectations that others will cooperate to solve dilemmas of collective action. Example, voluntary conservation to ease water or energy shortages. Less likelihood of working on a community project. Lower likelihood of giving to charity or volunteering. Fewer close friends and confidants. Less happiness and a lower perceived quality of life. More time spent watching television, and more agreement that television is my most important form of entertainment. In his conclusion, Putnam sums up his argument by saying, quote, "Diversity does not necessarily produce bad race relations or ethnically defined group hostility, our findings suggest. Rather, inhabitants of diverse communities tend to withdraw from social life, tend to distrust their neighbors, regardless of the color of their skin, to withdraw even from close friends, to expect the worst from their community and its leaders, to volunteer less, to give less to charity, and to work on community projects less, to register to vote less, to agitate for social reform more, but have less faith that they can actually make a difference, and to huddle unhappily in front of the television. Diversity, at least in the short run, seems to bring out the turtle in all of us." End quote. Some of you may be tempted to attribute the negative traits described in the Putnam study not to diversity, but to some other correlated demographic causal factor, such as poverty. One could make the argument that if more diverse communities tend to be poor, lacking access to the resources and necessities of life, that this might be responsible for the so-called ills of diversity. However, Putnam's results were obtained after controlling for age, ethnicity, education, affluence, poverty, residential mobility, citizenship, commute time, home ownership, regions of the country, gender, financial satisfaction, population density, income inequality, and crime rates. Thus, none of these aforementioned items can be used as an acceptable answer to explain the strong correlation between diversity and lack of social trust. We can say that all things being equal, more diversity leads to less social trust and vice versa. Now, I don't know about you, but it sounds to me from the research that choosing or living in a place that embraces such diversity sounds as though it has a negative impact on society, as it leads to less social trust. Whereas choosing to live and to voluntarily segregate yourself into a homogeneous community of people like yourself leads to greater levels of charity, volunteer work, more overall social trust, more close friends and confidence, greater overall happiness and quality of life, seemingly contrary to what the TheTruePooka says. Now, let's look at the evidence for national happiness as a factor of homogeneity. Psychologists at the University of Leicester in Britain produced the world's first map of happiness. Using data from the emerging science of happiness, they created a color-coded Atlas of Bliss, a topography of the human spirit from Swaziland to Singapore. The happiness places, explains Rutt van Hoven, director of the Institute, don't necessarily fit our preconceived notions. Quote, some of the happiest countries in the world, Iceland, Denmark, for instance, tend strongly to be homogeneous, shattering the American belief that there is strength and happiness in diversity. Here is a list of the 20 happiest nations. Most of them are overwhelmingly homogeneous, not diverse. It is also mentioning that the diverse U.S. is not on the top 20 list, despite being one of the richest countries in the world. Let's look at some additional evidence for diversity as a weakness and homogeneity as a strength. The next bit is from the book IQ and Global Inequality by Richard Lynn, who is a British professor emeritus of psychology at the University of Ulster, who graduated from Cambridge, and Tatu Van Hanen. IQ and Global Inequality examines the relationship between national IQs and a variety of social, economic, and standard of living phenomena. In their book, the authors present a large-scale measures of IQ for 113 countries and estimate the IQs for the remaining countries of the world for a total of 185. They showed that IQ correlated around 0.71 with per capita income and rates of economic growth from the year 1500 to the year 2000. A 0.71 correlation is a very strong correlation, rarely seen in the social sciences, as it is typically very unusual to get correlations over 0.5. As you can imagine, this has huge implications on the economic condition and development of countries. Overwhelmingly, the higher the national IQ of a nation, the more wealthy the country tends to be. The lower the IQ of a nation, the poorer it tends to be. Professors Lynn and Van Hanen have also calculated a composite of these 5 measures, which they call the Index of Quality of Human Conditions. They cross-check this index and its components against the UN's Human Development Index, which includes such things as undernourishment and infant mortality. They also mention other measures, like the Corruption Index. As you can see, there is a very strong correlation between quality of life conditions and national IQ. They also found that national differences in the rate of economic growth are almost entirely responsible for the contemporary differences in per capita income, 0.98 correlation. Their model also posits that national IQs are the determinant of a number of social phenomena, such as adult literacy, 0.64 correlation, enrollment in tertiary education, 0.75 correlation, life expectancy, 0.77 correlation, and democratization, 0.57 correlation, as well as significant positive correlations between IQ and economic freedom, and a variety of other factors. IQ and Global Inequality addresses more fundamentally the question of the causes of national differences in intelligence. It concludes that these depend on the racial compositions of the population. Thus, the 6 East Asian countries, China, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, all have IQs in the range of 105 to 108. The 29 European countries have IQs in the range of 92 to 102. The 19 countries of sub-Saharan Africa all have IQs in the range of 59 to 73. Thus, there is remarkable consistency in the IQs of countries when these countries are classified into racial clusters. In their book, Lynn and Van Hanen also address the arguments made by several critics as to the invalidity of the estimates of their national IQs from measured IQs of developing countries. They show that there is a correlation of 0.91 between the estimated IQs from 32 countries in their first book, IQ and the Wealth of Nations, and the measured IQs for those same countries given in their new book. This establishes the case that the estimated IQs were remarkably accurate. They also respond to a number of critics who attack the reliability and validity of national IQs. To address this question, the new book presents the results of 71 countries, for which 2 independent measures of IQ have been obtained, and shows that the correlation between these two is 0.95, which is a very high degree of reliability. To establish the validity of national IQs, they present the results of national scores from tests of mathematics and the sciences. These correlate with national IQs between 0.79 to 0.89, which is a high degree of validity. Now, what does this have to do with segregation having a positive impact on society? Well, I think that most of us would generally agree that all things being equal, factors which tend to increase economic growth, quality of life, quality of condition, as well as life expectancy and economic freedom and the education rate of a nation tend to be positive. Furthermore, I think that most of us would agree that factors which tend to decrease these things have a negative impact on society. Therefore, we can predict from these results that if, either by the immigration of persons from low IQ countries, such as Latin America or Sub-Saharan Africa, or through miscegenation between high and low IQ racial populations, whose mixed-race offspring regress to a lower mean, that this would tend to decrease average IQ. A decreased average IQ, in effect, would tend to nationally decrease economic growth, decrease average growth of per capita income, as well as decreasing average life expectancy, literacy, economic freedom, quality of life, quality of condition of a nation. Thus, we would predict that society could potentially avoid these ills by making itself relatively homogeneous in a sensible way, and that this sort of segregation would have a positive impact on society. Let's move on to the issue of race and crime. We'll look at the Color of Crime study, which uses data from the National Crime Victimization Survey. The National Crime Victimization Survey is a joint survey by the U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics and the U.S. Census Bureau. It is the largest, strongest supported, and most comprehensive survey of its kind when it comes to criminology statistics. The NCVS looks at over 100,000 victims of violent crime directly and asks them basic information about their attackers, such as what kind of crime was committed against them, and what was the perpetrator's age, race, sex, etc. Using this and other data, the Color of Crime study found that of the nearly 770,000 violent interracial crimes committed every year against blacks and whites, that blacks commit 85% of these crimes, and whites commit 15%. Also, keep in mind that blacks are only 13% of the population, where whites are 66% of the population, so blacks are disproportionately overrepresented when it comes to interracial crime. As you can see by the following figure, blacks commit more violent crime against whites than against blacks, both in relative and absolute terms. 45% of the victims of black perpetrators are white, 43% are black, and only 10% are Hispanic. By contrast, when you look at this figure, you can see that when whites commit violent crime, only about 3% of the victims are black. In total, blacks are an estimated 39 times more likely to commit violent crime against a white than vice versa, and 136 times more likely to commit robbery. One common sense answer to explain the crime difference is poverty and education. The argument goes that since blacks and Hispanics are poor and uneducated, they commit crimes against people who are better off than they are for their own benefit. However, this common sense answer doesn't stand up to scrutiny and to the available evidence. To quote the Color of Crime study directly, quote, "The the correlation between violent crime and the percentage of the population that is black and Hispanic is 0.78, even when poverty, education, and unemployment are controlled, versus 0.81 when they are not. In layman's terms, the statistical results suggest that even if whites were just as disadvantaged as blacks and Hispanics, the association between race and violent crime would still be almost as great. It may be harsh to state so plainly, but the single best indicator of an area's violent crime is its racial/ethnic mix." End quote. However, these aforementioned crime statistics do not, in and of themselves, say anything about the motivations of the criminals who commit interracial crime, only the frequency and probability of the crimes they do commit. However, there is a kind of interracial crime we can examine which does say something about the perpetrator's motives. This is, of course, hate crimes. And hate crimes are crimes motivated by one's race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or other prejudices. Before I go into the statistics from the Color of Crime study, it's worth mentioning that the government's treatment of hate crimes is quite misleading in one obvious way. For some reason, the government deceptively labels Hispanics as a victim category, but not a perpetrator category. This means that if someone attacks a Mexican for racial reasons, he becomes a Hispanic victim of a hate crime. However, if the same Mexican commits a hate crime against a black, he is classified as a white perpetrator of a hate crime. Despite this absurd governmental inconsistency skewing the results, blacks were still found to be 2.25 times more likely to commit an officially designated hate crime against whites than vice versa, although the actual result is probably much higher. Although our nation is reluctant to admit it, crime is clearly a racial problem. The best single predictor of a city or neighborhood's crime rate is its racial composition. The Color in Crime and other studies have found that blacks commit violent crimes at about 8 to 10 times the white rate, and Hispanics commit violent crime at roughly 3 to 5 times the white rate. Thus, on average, if a city's population changes from all white to, say, half white and half black, the violent crime rate can be expected to go up 5-fold, or 500%. All black areas are likely to have about 10 times as much violent crime as all white areas. If we agree that high crime areas have a negative impact on society, and since we know that race is the biggest predictor of violent crime, this would mean that whites would therefore benefit from forming their own small, homogeneous communities away from blacks and Hispanics because of the relatively smaller crime rates that tend to pervade these areas. Let's talk about welfare rates. Hispanics are the single major population group that is most likely to use welfare. According to the U.S. Census Bureau in 2004, 50% of Hispanic households use at least one form of welfare, compared to 47% of blacks and 18% of whites. If you're someone that doesn't like to be taxed, and doesn't like market inefficiencies caused by the excessive burden of taxation, known as deadweight loss, used to pay for welfare, then we would expect a positive impact on society via the segregation of persons to largely homogeneous white populations that don't have other large racial populations who are highly dependent on government welfare and transfer payments. If you want to associate primarily with people who are like-minded, then you are better off segregating yourself into predominantly white North American communities. According to a study by the Cato Institute, the overwhelming majority of libertarians are white, as you can see. Furthermore, according to a study of over 2,500 anarchists from several major anarchist websites, 88.5% of anarchists are white, 3.5% are indigenous, 3.3% are Semitic, 1.4% are East Asian, 1.2% are black, and 1% are South Asian. So if you're an anarchist or libertarian and prefer to associate with people who accept your own political philosophy, you would benefit from segregating yourself into a largely white community. and the happiness generated from this could be expected to have a positive impact on society.
Let's consider for a moment the hardship, violence, cost, and expense that would go into segregating, say, the American population. And please, don't put forward fantasies about everyone volunteering to merely segregate into different cities and states according to race. Because that's not going to happen. Putting forward such a premise is an absolute cop-out, a weak and feeble attempt to sidestep the issue and the fact that even under the best of circumstances, a significant amount of force is going to have to be exerted to enforce this voluntary segregation. The only way they could keep the population segregated prior to the civil rights movement was by reducing the rights of one group, black people in this case, so that they could justify and get away with using force against them. You think it's going to be any different now? You think that a city or state coded for black or white only population isn't going to have to reduce the rights of the racial population that all of a sudden finds itself in the shit out of luck seats? Please. Either you people are very stupid or very naive. Or you think that we're stupid or naive. I don't know which one it is.
Again, it's worth noting that although TheTruePooka asserts that voluntary segregation is some sort of fantasy cop-out, he doesn't put forward any argument that would seek to justify why this is supposedly the case. By the same token, TheTruePooka also asserts that violence is required for segregation to occur. However, as both of his assertions are not common knowledge, and as TheTruePooka put forward no argument that would seek to justify these positions, we therefore have no reason to accept them. Furthermore, we can see huge instances of purely voluntary segregation that occur in the present day, contrary to what TheTruePooka claims. If we look at social assortment of associates, friends, dating partners, and marital partners, housing and neighborhood patterns, schools, and the workplace, we can see large and significant voluntary segregation that occurs in the present day. Let's look at some of the evidence for voluntary segregation, shall we? Keep in mind that when it comes to housing, neighborhood, workplace, and school segregation, that the U.S. federal and state governments are actively seeking to impose desegregation. So the actual level of segregation that exists is shocking, considering that it occurs in spite of large government efforts and legal mandates that force people to desegregate. Let's start off by looking at voluntary segregation in housing and neighborhood patterns. According to a recent estimate from the United States Census Bureau, Latinos constitute 14.8% of the United States population, while the non-Latino population is 66.4% white, 13.4% African American, 4.9% Asian, 1.5% American Indian or Alaska Native, and 0.34% Hawaiian, Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. However, the average white person in a metropolitan America lives in a neighborhood that is 80% white and only 7% black. By stark contrast, the typical black individual lives in a neighborhood that is only 33% white and as much as 51% black, making African Americans the most residentially segregated group in the United States. Now, let's look at voluntary segregation in schooling. Quote, due to the severe white residential isolation in the outlying suburbs, white students are the least likely group to attend truly multiracial schools. In contrast, black and Latino students attend schools with a majority of students of their own groups. The average black student attends a school where 1/8 of the students are Latino, and the average Latino student is in a school with a similar fraction of blacks. Black and Latino students attend schools on average that are 30% or less white. The contrast in terms of contact with their own groups are most extreme for whites and Asians. Whites are the most isolated within their own racial groups, attending schools where almost 4/5 of the students are white. In contrast, Asians are the least isolated within their own racial group, with only about 1/5 of Asian classmates. To gain a better sense of how segregated the public schools are, we must examine the percentages of each group attending schools with different racial compositions. More than 3/4, 77%, of Latino students attend majority-minority schools, followed closely by black students at 73%. Asian and Native American students attend schools in substantial numbers, despite the fact that these groups together comprise just 5% of the total public school enrollment, and more than half of this group attends majority-minority schools. In contrast, less than 12% of white students attend these majority-minority schools, and less than 1% of white students attend overwhelmingly minority schools. More than a third of all black and Latino students attend 90 to 100% schools, followed by Native American students at 27%. More than 10% of each group attends 99 to 100% minority schools. Overall, black students experience more segregation than even their Native American peers do. Close to 90% of white students attend schools that are at least half white. Given the racial composition of our nation's public schools, where close to 60% of students are white, this is to be expected. However, 2 out of every 5 white students attend schools that are 90 to 100% white. In contrast, only about 2% of black and Latino students, 6% of Asians, and 8% of Native American students attend these overwhelmingly white schools. Now let's look at segregation among marital patterns. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, 97.8% of married whites are married to another white person, despite whites being only 66% of the population. 92.3% of married blacks are married to a fellow black person, despite being only 13% of the population. And 87.15% of Asians are married to another Asian person, despite being only 5% of the population. According to the Pew Research Center, only about 8% of married people are married to someone outside of their own race. This is not what we would predict if we assumed that people had no preference for segregating from their own marital partners on the basis of race, because of the relative degree of racial diversity that exists in the United States today. However, this is exactly what we would predict if we assume that people have a preference for racial similarity. Let's look at voluntary segregation in dating, shall we? According to a new University of California at Berkeley study of 1 million online daters, cyberspace is just as segregated as the real world. When it comes to dating online, whites prefer whites, as the research reveals. More than 80% of whites, and even 48% of males and 28% of females who said that they were indifferent to race, sent messages to whites, and just 3% of them contacted blacks. Mendelsohn says there are 3 possible reasons for the discrepancy between attitudes about interracial couplings and the actual behavior of online daters. Quote, "It might be appearance management," he says. They think that it makes them look better to say that they're open to another race. Also, saying that you're open to another race is only stage 1 of the dating process. Stage 2 is actually taking the step. Another possibility that can't be discounted is that people are just hypocritical." End quote. A major objective of the study was how changing attitudes about interracial marriage and an increase in dating opportunities have played out in the relationship between blacks and whites. In the last 40 years, the approval rating of black-white intermarriage has gone from 3-to-1 opposed to even more than 3-to-1 in favor, Mendelsohn says, but the study found that attitudes and behavior don't match. Similar studies were done by the large free dating site OkCupid, which found that people prefer members of their own race, and you can see some of their results by the following chart. For evidence of people generally preferring racial similarity in their relationships and voluntarily segregating to achieve it, we can look at Miller McPherson, Lynn Smith-Levin, and James Cook in their article titled Birds of a Feather, Homophily in Social Networks, published in 2001 in the Journal Review of Sociology. Let me quote the review in the scientific literature of this subject. Quote, "Race and ethnicity are clearly the biggest divide in social networks today in the United States, and play a major part in structuring the networks of other ethnically diverse societies as well. We find strong homophily, love of sameness, on race and ethnicity in a wide array of relationships ranging from the most intimate bonds of marriage and confiding to the limited ties of schoolmate friendship and work relations, to the limited networks of discussion about a particular topic, to the mere fact of appearing in public together, or knowing about someone else. Even the negative ties of crime, victimization, and rape follow this pattern. In a national probability sample, only 8% of adults with network sizes 2 or more mention having another person of another race with whom they discuss important matters. Less than 1/7 of the heterogeneity that we would observe if people chose randomly from the populations. People are also much more likely to report that their confidants are connected to one another if these confidants are of the same race. Of course, people often mention spouses and other kin as confidants, so powerful marital homeogamy on race increases homophily of confiding relations. But the degree of racial heterogeneity is still only 1/4 the potential, even if we look at people who don't mention kin in their discussion network. Anglos have a much more racially homogeneous network than any other racial or ethnic group. African Americans and Hispanics fall at moderate levels of racial homophily. The baseline phenomena is not important in large populations, but also in more limited settings, like classrooms and work organizations. Reskin reports that almost 1 in 4 businessmen establishments employ no minorities, while slightly more than 1/4 employ fewer than 10% of minorities. Similarly, the National Organization study found that 34% of all establishments are white, and the median establishment is 80% white. Racial homophily occurs in friendship networks by the early grades. In the 3rd grade, for example, Shroom observed only 2/3 of the cross-race friendships expected by chance. Racial homophily increases steadily until only 10% of cross-race friendships are observed in the middle school, and then levels out for the rest of high school." End quote. Although no one likes to talk about it, the United States is a highly segregated country, not a desegregated country like TheTruePooka later claims. Everywhere, we see instances of people preferring people like themselves, and forming racially homogeneous communities, friends, community groups, social clubs, and family units. Therefore, when TheTruePooka says the only way they could keep the population segregated prior to the civil rights movement was by reducing the rights of one group, black people in this case, so they could justify and get away with using force against them, you think it's going to be any different now? It is a matter of fact that he is not only wrong, but that the implications of his rhetorical question are wrong. This is because we see massive levels of segregation occurring in the United States today, and even in the past, on a completely voluntary basis.
The reason segregationists use the everyone should just do it because it is morally right argument is because they're just clever enough to know that without this little a miracle occurs formula they've come up with, segregationist ideology ends up being in direct conflict with one of the most basic principles of libertarian philosophy, that you don't use force against others and infringe on their individuality. From a right libertarian position, using even the slightest force to cause segregation, it is unacceptable. There's just no way around it.
TheTruePooka alleges that segregationists claim that everyone should segregate because it's the morally right thing to do. However, he never identified any source for his alleged claim. So, as far as we know, TheTruePooka might be arguing against a figment of his own imagination, or he might be strawmanning a group or individual person. Since he never identified who he's arguing against, we literally have no way of knowing. Furthermore, He alleges that what he calls segregationists are supposedly ideologically in conflict with the basic tenets of deontological libertarianism. Although, again, he doesn't argue for this, he just asserts it, so we can dismiss him here for not meeting the burden of proof.
I suppose racial realist segregationists could try to play around with the left libertarian concept of natural resources are owned by all, claim human genes are a natural resource, and try to justify forced segregation that way, but I'm not buying it. Just like with moral allowances, which is really just a form of ends justifies means philosophy, you're making a claim about the genetic material of human beings that you cannot back up. And considering that the supposed benefits of preventing race mixing by segregating are tenuous at best, even if you accept the genetic fantasy the race realist segregationists have put forward when looked at from a cost profitability point of view. The only way to do such a racial segregation on such a mass scale is if you gave widespread massive power to the federal government and used law enforcement to enforce that massive power you've given to the federal government, because without the federal government there would inevitably be interstate conflict. Not to mention all the death and destruction that would come about when individuals started volunteering other people out of the area with the business end of a gun. Because last I checked, such a project would be enormously expensive, and I'm wondering how you're going to raise that money. A segregation tax? Or are you going to volunteer the money out of the pockets of those who are in the shit out of luck seats?
TheTruePooka certainly has a knack for repeating himself over and over again, but never does he provide any good evidence or arguments supporting the claim that segregation or creating homogeneous societies leads to any bad effects, or that such societies have no benefits. The burden of proof is on him to show this, and we can easily say that he did not meet it since he made no argument or offered no empirical evidence that would even attempt to demonstrate such a thing. Thus, we can disregard, yet again, what he says, until he offers some convincing evidence and argument that would satisfy the burden of proof.
If that's the case, you know what? There's a seat waiting for you at the table right beside Bank of America and Citibank when they have their next "How can we fuck over the American people and convince them they deserve it" meeting. So, you know what? I'm curious to hear some of the race realist segregationists respond to this. I'm curious to hear what you have to say, assuming that they do claim to be an anarcho-capitalist or some other brand of libertarian. I am curious to hear how these statists can justify how they can call themselves libertarians when your positions so obviously call for a greater expansion of state and federal government powers, not to mention the use of force to infringe on other people's maximum equal empirical negative liberty.
If TheTruePooka is trying to make some sort of argument here, then he's made the classic guilt by association fallacy. He attempts to appeal to our passions by referencing an irrelevant association between evil corporations like Bank of America doing nefarious deeds and the illusionary group of people he seems to be arguing against, when this does not follow. Furthermore, the burden of proof is on him to show how the positions of the people he supposedly argue against entail the expansion of the state and federal government, the initiation of force, and the limiting of people's negative liberty.
And please, don't start whinging on about the civil rights movement and how the federal government forced desegregation. That is immaterial to the topic at hand. What we have right here and now is a desegregated population, and statist segregationists like Heritability and fringe elements have to put forward a plan on how to make this happen with a minimum of force, cost, bloodshed, and property damage, one that a true libertarian would find acceptable. Because we are waiting for you to submit your master plan. Be bold. Think outside the box. Oh, and if you're a libertarian and you had to look up the phrase maximum equal empirical negative liberty, then stop calling yourself a libertarian. Bloody dilettantes.
As we have shown, we do not live in a desegregated population here and now. Furthermore, TheTruePooka has not shown how either fringe elements or Heritability are either statists or advocate state violence to impose segregation. Thus, not only should we disregard what he says, but since I've seen a large cross-section of Heritability and Fringe Elements videos, and I've never once heard them espouse any of the positions he alleges them to have, it seems to me that either the TheTruePooka is ignorant of their position, or he's just flat-out lying. And it seems to me that none of these results are very flattering.
You know what? The racial realist segregationist is the worst kind of statist because they're the type that doesn't even have the balls to step forward and say, let's do this thing. Instead, they try to use science and scare tactics and then sit back and wait for the people to mob up and take action. They don't even have the balls to speak out for statism. They try to get other people to do their dirty work for them.
You know, I'm just thinking that the TheTruePooka is just a spiteful person. He seems to be very keen on slinging mud at people who disagree with him. But he does this without backing up his claims with empirical evidence or arguments. And that just seems kinda shitty.